right, Red Shirts. Hello. Welcome to another rookie profile. We're here to talk about quarterback Jalen Hurts out of Oklahoma. You may have heard me mention him a couple times on recent pods. I'm a pretty big fan. I have a very intended landing spot. It makes me excited. We'll get to that in a little bit. But we're going to break him down a little bit. We're going to talk about his potential and his attributes and see what we think of him from a rookie standpoint, where you maybe want to draft him. So let's get into it. Quarterback out of Oklahoma last year. Prior to that, he played at Alabama for 3 seasons. 2 as a starter, then he got replaced by Tua 2018. Wasn't the starter, so he decided to go somewhere else. Went to Oklahoma, replaced Kyler Murray, who replaced Baker Mayfield, was kind of the successor in that chain of excellent quarterbacks, number ones, in fact, and showed out pretty well there. So an interesting college career. Ended up being 38-4 as a starter overall. Very nice. Senior year, let's talk about his senior year. 3,800 passing yards, 32 touchdowns, 8 picks. Pretty good passing numbers. However, we care more about the rushing numbers because that's where he pops off the page. 1,300 rushing yards and 20 rushing touchdowns. Disgusting, incredible fantasy production. This is a guy, 4th player in the last 20 years. All right, only 4. Jalen Hurts is one of them, who had 30 touchdowns and 30 passing touchdowns and 20 rushing touchdowns in a single season in college. The other guys, Lamar Jackson, Cam Newton, and Tim Tebow. All fantasy relevant. Obviously, Tim Tebow much less. Tim Tebow ended up being the only one who didn't have a great career overall, or well, Lamar is early, but certainly we expect to have a great career overall for the NFL and for fantasy, and just because he couldn't throw the ball for diddly squat, Jalen Hurts can throw the ball better. Here's something I love. Fantasy points as a senior at Oklahoma final season. I talked about this with Kyler Murray last year. Baker Mayfield, 412 fantasy points. Quite nice. Kyler Murray, 500 fantasy points. Wow, that's a big jump. Sounds very relevant. The rushing helps a lot. Jalen Hurts? 516 fantasy points. More than Kyler Murray. This guy is a guy who is going to produce fantasy points at the NFL level if he is the starter in the right system. We will get to a lot of that in a bit, but just wanted to throw that out there. Last season, Heisman runner-up. To Joe Burrow, best college football season of all time. In other words, Jalen Hurts is a Heisman Trophy winner in most college seasons. He's very good. Also, he has gotten better. Like, what we saw from him last year is much different from what we saw from him in his freshman year. And that improvement over the course of his college career is something that I like a lot because it's something that I could see translating forward into the NFL as well, where right now a lot of draft analysts, scouts see him as maybe a second-round pick, late second-round pick. He is a guy who could continue to go up in his stock as he goes closer to the draft, which is only a few weeks away, but then more importantly, through the NFL level, and be a guy who we see as a top 5, top 10 quarterback pick in a few years down the line. So I like a lot of that. All right, let's get to his pros and cons, or strengths and weaknesses. Strengths. This guy's a playmaker. From that standpoint, he reminds me of Russell Wilson. I'm not saying he's Russell Wilson, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying from a playmaker standpoint, he has a lot of Russell Wilson qualities, whether it's inside the pocket, outside the pocket, when he's scrambling, on design runs, in the red zone. We talked about his 20 rushing touchdowns. He is a guy who is able to extend plays and make plays happen both with his arms and with his legs where other quarterbacks would not be able to do so. And a lot of that translates to fantasy, and I like that a lot. Athletically, easily the best quarterback in this class, worth talking about for your fantasy drafts. Possibly one of the most athletic quarterbacks in any recent draft when we're talking about fantasy. I mean, Lamar Jackson's certainly fast and can make guys miss in the open field. Cam Newton back in the day, a guy who's going to run over you and score touchdowns. Jalen Hurts kind of has a little bit of both, and it's really nice from a fantasy perspective. It's the kind of guy who, if he's on the field a lot and gets enough carries, we're going to talk about one of the best rushing fantasy quarterbacks in the league from a yards plus touchdowns perspective, and you saw it in his college senior season. So that's really nice. Tough, strong, durable, competitive. He runs through contact when he's on the move. All of those things together means this guy has Cam Newton type rushing potential. maybe with even less injuries because he's a little bit smarter, a little bit faster, uses his ability to get down maybe a little better than Cam Newton, who's just going to try to smash three. So I like a lot of that. Also, one of his biggest strengths is a little bit maybe underrated, especially from fantasy analysts who just look at the numbers, is his intangibles, his character, his leadership, his intelligence, his ability to break down plays. We saw a whiteboard with Steve Mariucci. If you saw that, look it up. Very smart about football. He is a guy who is going to be a leader who, if given the chance to be the starter for a team, is going to command the respect of his team, win games, and while that doesn't necessarily translate to fantasy as immediately as, oh, he throws tons of yards, throws a ton of touchdowns, it matters because he's going to be a guy who keeps a job, who earns his teammates respect, and that will translate on the field. So I like a lot of that. Quickly getting into his weaknesses. Ball placement and accuracy. He is not a Tom Brady or a Peyton Manning or even a Kyler Murray from Oklahoma last year, Baker Mayfield from the year before, guys who we know are going to be pinpoint accurate. He struggles a little bit with that. He's going to throw behind guys a little bit on crossers. He's going to maybe underthrow guys deep a little bit. His anticipation is not especially good. And his vision of the field is not extremely good either. That's one of his weaknesses as well. So he's not going to see the field like, those elite quarterbacks that I mentioned, the in-the-pocket type guys like a Brady or a Manning. And his accuracy is not going to be Drew Brees level by any means. So a lot of that brings down potentially his passing upside a little bit. Again, I think he's the kind of guy who could develop in those respects. And we'll get to one of my big points on that in a second. But certainly he's not going to come in the league and have a 70% completion percentage and wow you with his anticipation throws and his accuracy on the outside or anything like that. So those do detract a little bit. His mental processing. I mentioned his anticipation. Also his ability to go through reads. His ability to read the defense. It's not necessarily going to be great either. It's going to be a little bit below, not necessarily below average, maybe around average, but not something great, not a strength or an elite level ability where we're going to see him, I'm going to put him in the conversation with those Bradys and Mannings, like I said, which, to be fair, you don't need to be in the conversation of Brady and Manning to be good at fantasy. But certainly that is one of the weaknesses for him. He's a guy who's potentially going to throw a lot of picks at the next level. Didn't throw a lot of picks in his senior season in college, but I could see him having a little bit of Jameis Winston in those aspects. Hopefully not to the degree of Jameis Winston. Almost no one in the league is to the degree of Jameis Winston. But certainly not one of his strengths. And then also tends to leave the pocket a little bit too early. His patience is not quite there. If you watch his tape, he's going to be someone who, when the pocket starts to collapse, though he senses it very well, he's not going to be like a Deshaun Watson who just holds the ball and doesn't realize he's about to get sacked. He will tend to, maybe if he has space in the pocket and could step up, he's not going to do that. And instead he's going to try to avoid the pressure by running away. And sometimes that's okay for fantasy. It's better even than it is for the NFL because it may turn into a run that gets him 6-7 yards, and that's kind of nice. But just from a quarterback evaluation and scouting standpoint, that is a weakness that he has. All right, so let's get into the number one point for me. The number one point, aside from strengths and weaknesses, is where he goes from a team perspective and from a coach perspective. He needs a good head coach, and ideally offensive coordinator as well. This is one of the reasons I've been harping on and praying for Jalen Hurts to the Patriots. If Jalen Hurts gives a Bill Belichick and Josh McDaniels combo, I honestly think he has Russell Wilson upside. Not saying he will be that, but if he gets a coach who can hone in on his weaknesses, fix them, and create a system around him with an OC like Josh McDaniels, creative and smart OC, who can design something around him that works, put in RPOs, put in design runs, put in the types of passing plays that work to his strengths. If he gets that kind of situation, he is 100% a first-round superflex for me pick in Dynasty. He is 100% a top 2, maybe top 15 pick in a non-superflex draft. And he is a guy who's going to be in my top 3 quarterbacks for rookies with Burrow and Tagovailoa easily. However, if he goes to a place that I don't trust, if he goes to a Washington because I don't trust Dwayne Haskins, if he goes to I don't want to say Miami, but I imagine Miami picks someone a little bit earlier, but a Miami or even an LA who clearly needs a quarterback, but I don't trust the coaching system as much. it's not going to feel as good for me as if he goes to a Patriots type organization. That is going to matter a lot. So keep an eye on landing spot. That's going to matter. From a comps perspective, it's really hard to comp Jalen Hurts because he's pretty unique. I kind of like to say he's a playmaking light version of Russell Wilson, which I mentioned earlier, plus a better throwing version of Tim Tebow, plus a smaller Cam Newton. It's hard to pin down, to be honest. He's a little bit of an anomaly. And like I said earlier, extremely wide range of outcomes. This is a guy who could be a Johnny Manziel level bust or a Russell Wilson level value. And it's really tough to say which it will be. However, keep your eye on his landing spot. If he gets drafted in the top 50 to 60 of the NFL draft and goes to a team where we can trust his coach and coordinator, this is a guy I think you're going to want to pick early in your rookie drafts. And this is a guy who I think will be extremely valuable in fantasy and you're going to enjoy having for a long time. So that is Jalen Hurts. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I am and we are the Red Shirt.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Red Shirts Fantasy Football Podcast. Hit us up on Twitter at RedShirtsFFPod and check out our website, redshirtsfantasyfootball.com.